It begins with the cheer of 1,000 courtiers, the clatter of hooves, the glitter of armour, the smell of cold January air thick with pride. Then a crash. Steel meets bone, horse meets earth, and the world's most dangerous ego meets gravity. The crowd gasps. For 2 hours there's no breath, no motion, and history holds itself still, wondering if England's story just ended in a pile of splintered lances and very bad decisions. That day, January 24th, 1536, Henry VIII should have died. He didn't. He woke, and the monster of legend was born. But what if he hadn't? What if the great Tudor flame went out right there, in the mud of Greenwich Palace? If you love wandering down history's darker corridors, and if you've ever said, "I'll subscribe later," remember, even kings run out of time. Don't leave it too late. So, before we begin, what time is it where you are tonight? Now, let the noise fade and drift back to the England that unravelled the moment a king stopped breathing. January 24th, 1536. The air at Greenwich smells of horse sweat, iron, and pride. Banners ripple against a sky that can't decide whether it's winter or spring. Then the sound, the one no one forgets, steel against flesh, hooves skidding on frozen mud, and a gasp that seems to swallow the world whole. For 2 long hours Henry VIII lies silent. His courtiers hover like nervous birds, whispering prayers they don't quite remember. Someone calls for the royal physicians, someone else for a priest. They all look at one another, hoping one of them will make a decision that doesn't involve blame. The most powerful man in England has met his match, and it was gravity. By noon, the whispers have reached every corridor. The king is dead, or dying, or perfectly fine, depending on who you ask and who's paying. A court built on certainty now feeds on rumour. The tilt yard, moments ago a theatre of pageantry, has turned into a funeral stage with no one brave enough to give the sermon. Thomas Cromwell stands still at the edge of the chaos, already turning the disaster into mathematics. Power must be held, money guarded, panic managed. Across the field, the Duke of Norfolk is writing imaginary letters in his head, addressed to whichever heir will take the throne. And somewhere inside the palace, Anne Boleyn, 3 months pregnant and trembling, clutches her stomach and prays for both her husband and her own survival. No one knows what happens next. There is no will, no clear heir, no adult prince to rally around. The kingdom runs on Henry's command, and suddenly there is none. In the kitchens, fires burn out for lack of orders. Servants tiptoe through hallways as though sound itself might be treason. The palace hums with uncertainty, the air thick with perfume, sweat, and fear. By afternoon, London already knows. Fishermen on the Thames stop rowing to listen for bells. Merchants close their stalls. Gossip outruns the wind. The king is struck down, says one man. The queen bewitched him, says another. A third claims to have seen the horse kneel as if in mourning. It's nonsense, but it spreads. England runs on stories more than laws. At Westminster, the Privy Council gathers, or pretends to. They sit in solemn confusion, all powdered dignity and hidden panic. The Archbishop suggests prayer. Norfolk suggests soldiers. Cromwell suggests waiting. None of them suggest Anne Boleyn. For the moment, she's too dangerous to support and too valuable to condemn. Outside, the first bells toll for a royal death. No one knows who rang them, but within minutes half the city joins in, while the other half shouts for silence, terrified of committing treason by being too early. The sound rolls across the river like thunder, and then fades, leaving a hollow echo that feels like the space between heartbeats. Anne cannot hear them, but she feels their weight. In her chambers she paces, one hand pressed to her abdomen. Every step is measured, every breath deliberate. She tells her ladies to smile, to act as though the king sleeps peacefully nearby. One bursts into tears. Anne doesn't scold her. She envies the honesty. Cromwell drafts orders in the dim light of his chamber. Secure the treasury, the tower, and the ships. He stamps them with the king's seal because no one has told him not to. He knows this is what the end of a dynasty feels like, not drama, but paperwork. As dusk falls, Greenwich becomes a maze of candlelight. Every corner hums with whispers. One rumour insists Henry stirred and spoke. Another claims his body's already being prepared for burial. A servant swears the Queen fainted. Another swears she's given birth. None of it is true, but all of it might as well be. London doesn't sleep. The taverns are full of men arguing over a monarch who can't defend himself. God has struck him down, mutters one drunk voice before being shushed by a dozen others. No one knows what counts as loyalty tonight. In a quiet corner of the chapel, a young clerk kneels and hesitates before speaking. God save the king feels premature. God receive him feels treacherous. He settles for God help us, which seems safest. The candle beside him sputters and dies. By midnight, Anne sits alone by the window. The Thames below is dark and slick as oil. The wind rattles the shutters. She imagines she can still hear the crash, over and over, like a heartbeat that won't stop. Somewhere deep inside, something twists. She tells herself she must stay calm, must not cry, must not lose the only thing left that ties her to power. In the council chamber, the men argue softly but viciously. If Henry is gone, who rules? Elizabeth is 2 years old. Mary is 20 and illegitimate. Fitzroy, the bastard son, is still living but sickly. Each name comes with its own trap. Cromwell suggests a regency council. Norfolk mutters that the country will never follow a woman, let alone two. The discussion dissolves into silence. Not agreement, just exhaustion. Outside. The torches burn low. A watchman glances toward the palace and mutters to his companion, "It feels wrong, don't it? Like the whole country's holding its breath." The other man shrugs. Maybe God's thinking what to do next. By dawn, frost has crusted over the tilt yard. The lances have been cleared, the crowd gone home, the banners folded away. Only a single glove remains, jewelled and heavy, half sunk in mud. It catches the light as the sun rises. A small, glittering relic of pride. No one dares touch it. Inside, the great bedchamber of Greenwich stands empty except for a few guards who refuse to meet one another's eyes. The throne, though miles away in Westminster, feels equally abandoned. Power, it turns out, needs someone to believe in it. And today, no one does. For the first time in a century, England has no king, no plan, and no idea what comes next. The air itself seems to hesitate, as though waiting for someone, anyone, to speak the words that will shape the future. But no one does. The courtiers who once lived by Henry's smile now hide from his shadow. The kingdom drifts without anchor, without centre, without certainty. And in that silence, longer than any sermon, heavier than any prayer, the truth finally settles over England like a shroud. The throne sits empty, and no one dares sit upon it. The news reaches her in fragments, carried by pale faces and trembling lips. First, that the king still does not wake. Then, that he is breathing. Then, that he isn't. By the time the truth arrives, it's too late for words to mean much at all. Henry is dead. Anne Boleyn sits in the Queen's apartments motionless, a glass of watered wine in her hand that she hasn't touched for hours. The air feels wrong, thin, as though the palace itself is holding its breath. The room is crowded and silent all at once. Ladies whisper near the door, speaking in the strange, reverent tone reserved for funerals and childbirth. No one knows which this is. Anne stares at the hearth until her eyes sting. The fire hisses, a sound like laughter she cannot stand. She sends everyone away. The click of the door closing behind them sounds final, like the ceiling of a tomb. She presses both hands over her stomach as if she might hold her future in place. The child is her shield, her last protection. Without a living king, she's no longer wife but widow, and not even that for long. She knows how quickly affection turns into accusation at court. She has watched it happen to others. Now it will happen to her. Night falls early that winter. The candles burn low. Outside, London's bells toll for a king most people have never seen. Inside the palace there are no tears, only the careful silence of people afraid to be noticed. Cromwell has taken over the late king's chambers, or so the servants whisper. He spends the night dictating letters to every corner of England, each one a performance of calm authority. No one dares ask who gave him that authority. In the small hours, Anne walks the length of her chamber again and again, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. Every movement feels strange, too heavy, too fragile. She whispers to the child as if it might understand. "You must live," she says softly. "You must." Outside her window, the Thames is black and still. Somewhere across the water, a dog barks and is immediately shushed. Even the animals know something is wrong. When dawn comes, it brings no peace. Her women return with their red eyes and folded hands. They tell her the council will not see her yet. They say she should rest, as if anyone in England could sleep now. She laughs, a small cracked sound, and dismisses them again. The laugh feels good for half a second, then cruel. She covers her mouth and weeps into her palm, though not loudly. Queens must never weep loudly. Cromwell, meanwhile, is at his desk. He has not slept either. His ink runs thin, his patience thinner. Every document he drafts feels like walking a tightrope. He writes the word majesty, and then crosses it out, uncertain to whom it applies. Without a king, the state itself is a ghost. He thinks of Anne, the woman who helped him climb and who could now drag him down. His loyalty, he decides, must belong to the crown, even if no one is wearing it. By afternoon, the palace smells of herbs and vinegar, the scent of death politely masked. Courtiers begin to arrive in their blackest clothes, not out of respect, but ambition. To be seen grieving in the right company is as useful as any will. Anne remains hidden. Her ladies report that she is ill, which is true in more ways than one. She has stopped eating. When they speak to her, she answers slowly, as though words must travel through water before reaching her tongue. The pain begins in the evening, a dull ache that tightens and builds. She thinks at first it's nothing, nerves, exhaustion, grief. But as the night deepens, the truth becomes undeniable. Her child is leaving her. The palace corridors blur as she is half carried, half dragged to her bed. Candles blur into halos, voices melt into echoes. The midwife says something about breathing. Anne tries, but every breath feels like a betrayal. There is no screaming. The sound she makes is quieter, more terrible. A whisper that seems to pull the light out of the room. When it is over, she feels only emptiness, a strange, heavy silence inside her where life should have been. Someone covers her with blankets. Someone else removes the small, still bundle from the bed. She does not look. She cannot. The fire pops once, startling everyone. The smell of wax fills the air. The next morning, the palace wakes to 2 deaths, one famous, one private. The bells toll again. No one knows whether they ring for king or child. Anne lies still, her face turned toward the wall. Her ladies murmur prayers, but she hears none of them. Outside, footsteps pass quickly. The court has moved on already. The widow's grief, though tragic, is no longer politically useful. Cromwell receives news of the miscarriage with a slow blink, neither surprised nor cruel. It simplifies things. A widow with no son is a loose end that can be tied neatly, if handled correctly. He begins drafting another letter, this one to the Duke of Norfolk. He writes in his neat hand, "Her Grace is unwell," which is the sort of sentence that can mean anything at all. By midday, the council has agreed to secure the Queen, not arrest, not yet. Just relocate her to safer, smaller quarters. The euphemism comforts no one. Anne, too weak to resist, allows herself to be led down the corridor. She notices how the guards avoid looking at her. She thinks, absurdly, that she should thank them for their discretion. Every few steps she stumbles. Every stumble feels like prophecy. They settle her in a chamber overlooking the river. The view is beautiful and unbearable. She remembers arriving at court years ago, full of laughter and dangerous confidence, never imagining the view would one day be a cage. The wind off the Thames rattles the window panes. It sounds almost like applause. She laughs again, softly, bitterly, and the sound frightens her ladies. By nightfall, Cromwell's messengers have already reached the ports and the garrisons. England's future is being decided in ink and candlelight. No one comes to see the Queen. Even her uncle Norfolk sends only a brief note of condolences, carefully unsigned. The palace hums with new energy, a kind of cautious relief. The problem, everyone agrees, has solved itself. Anne wakes briefly near dawn. The sky outside her window is pale and cold, the river grey as metal. She feels lighter, but not free. There is nothing left in her now to defend her place in the world. She reaches for the small embroidered cap on her bedside table, the one she'd sewn for the child. Her hand hovers above it, and then falls back to the bed. Down the hall, Cromwell gives his final order for the night. The Queen is to remain confined, her visitors restricted, her correspondence monitored. He seals the paper with wax, watches it cool, and murmurs almost kindly, "It's better this way." Then he blows out the candle. Morning breaks over Greenwich, cold and unfeeling. The court dresses in mourning, but not for her. Servants sweep away footprints, wash sheets, clear rooms for new occupants. History, as always, moves faster than grief. And in that quiet room above the river, where the wind rattles the glass and no child's cry will ever be heard, the truth settles like dust on the floor. The cradle is empty, and the wolves begin to circle. When a king dies without an heir, the English don't pause to mourn. They begin to form committees. Within days of Henry's fall, London is thick with those who have suddenly discovered their patriotic duty to decide who should rule next. 3 names hang over every conversation: Mary, Elizabeth, and Henry Fitzroy, each surrounded by supporters, sycophants, and people pretending to be both. It's a mess of theology, politics, and family drama. Exactly the sort of thing the Tudors excelled at. First, there is Elizabeth, 2 years old, wide-eyed, and inconveniently female. According to the new Church of England, she is the legitimate heir, the child of Henry's lawful marriage to Anne Boleyn. According to nearly everyone else, she's the product of her father's midlife crisis. To the Conservatives, she's a bastard born of scandal. To the Reformers, she's a symbol of the future. To most of the nobility, she's a problem they would very much prefer someone else to solve. Anne's remaining allies, those brave or foolish enough to still be seen near her name, cling to Elizabeth's claim as if faith itself depends on it. They argue that Henry broke with Rome for this child, that the crown has already been blessed in her blood. They say it softly, of course. Shouting such things can get you charged with heresy by breakfast and buried by supper. Cromwell, ever practical, does not say much at all. He has learned that silence lasts longer than loyalty. Then there is Mary, the firstborn, the Catholic, the wronged daughter of Catherine of Aragon. In better times, Henry's stubbornness had stripped her of titles, status, and peace of mind. But death is a curious redeemer, and now she's suddenly fashionable again. The old guard, the bishop still loyal to Rome, and half of the nobility north of the Thames rally quietly to her side. To them, she's not just the rightful heir, but a moral victory, a chance to undo years of royal heresy with one coronation. The problem, of course, is legal. Henry had declared her illegitimate by Act of Parliament, and the English are nothing if not devoted to their paperwork. Undoing it would require new proclamations, new oaths, and new enemies. Still, her faction grows. Across London, priests who had been whispering Mass in secret begin to stand a little taller. They dare to speak Mary's name out loud again. It tastes like both hope and treason. And finally, there's Fitzroy, Henry's acknowledged illegitimate son by Elizabeth Blount. 17, handsome, and, for now, alive. He carries enough titles to fill a small tapestry: Duke of Richmond, Duke of Somerset, Lord High Admiral of England, and so on. None of which make him legitimate, but legitimacy, as everyone in Tudor England knows, is negotiable when convenient. Fitzroy has supporters too, men who mutter that England needs a man on the throne, not another argument about who counts as a wife. The Duke of Norfolk favours Fitzroy's claim, not because of principle, but because Fitzroy is married to Norfolk's own daughter. Nothing warms a man's heart like the scent of proximity to power. Cromwell, meanwhile, calculates the odds and finds them changing by the hour. He doesn't commit to any faction. He merely records who visits whom, who writes what letters, and who looks nervous while doing it. He knows the first to choose sides is often the first to fall, and so, as January fades into February, the kingdom begins to fracture in spirit, if not yet in arms. Letters of alliance are drafted in candlelit rooms. Coins are quietly hoarded. Even the servants have opinions. At every supper table, every tavern bench, the debate hums like a fever. Should England be ruled by the daughter of a queen who defied the Pope, the daughter of a queen who defied the king, or the son of a woman who was never queen at all? In the city's churches, the clergy pray loudly for a peaceful settlement, which everyone knows is code for "please don't make us choose." In the north, farmers cross themselves and mutter that all this trouble comes from letting women read the Bible. In the south, merchants simply sigh and raise prices. Chaos, after all, is good for business. Anne, secluded and grieving, hears of these debates in fragments. A whispered report from a lady, a half-hearted reassurance from a frightened messenger. Elizabeth's name drifts through her dreams like smoke. She wonders if the child will even live long enough to see a crown, or if the throne will simply pass from hand to hand like an expensive curse. At court, Cromwell's rooms glow long after midnight. He sits at his desk surrounded by maps, ledgers and letters, each one representing a possible future. One with Mary's face, one with Elizabeth's, one with Fitzroy's. Each future has its price. He's just trying to work out which will cost him least. England itself seems to hold its breath. 3 claimants, 3 visions of God's will, and not a single man or angel brave enough to declare which one is right. The council pretends to deliberate, but everyone knows it will come down to whoever controls the tower, the treasury and the army. And at the moment, no one truly does. The skies over London turn grey and heavy, as if even the weather is exhausted by all this ambition. Somewhere, a bell tolls again, not for death this time, but for warning. The people have begun to sense what their betters already know. The peace that followed the king's death will not last. In the palace, Cromwell stands before the great royal seal. He studies it for a long moment, that neat symbol of authority now belonging to no one. Then, with a sigh that's half amusement, half despair, he murmurs, "Well, we can't all be legitimate." And outside, beyond the walls of power, the storm clouds gather over England, thick, dark, and ready to break. 3 names, 3 faiths, 1 crown. And before the storm breaks, you might want to make sure you're still here to hear it. Don't be like the nobles who waited too long to pick a side. Hit subscribe now, before history moves on without you. The Tower of London had never been meant for comfort. Even in daylight, it wore its history like a frown. A fortress of stone built by men who thought warmth and mercy were architectural flaws. When Anne Boleyn arrived there in February of 1536, it was not as a prisoner, not yet, but as a widow in need of safety, which, in Tudor England, is rather like seeking comfort in a crypt. The journey from Greenwich to the Tower is short, but it feels like exile. The Thames carries her barge in near silence. The water slaps against the hull with a rhythm that sounds uncomfortably like a heartbeat. The oarsmen don't look at her. The ladies don't speak. Somewhere on the north bank, a group of apprentices stop to stare, hats in hand. They bow clumsily, half out of respect, half out of confusion. No one is sure how to greet a woman who is still technically queen, but only in the way ghosts are still technically people. The Tower looms ahead, its walls rising out of the mist like a memory England would rather forget. The ravens shift restlessly on their perches as the barge approaches. Anne steps ashore, her hand on her lady's arm for balance, and looks up at the great gate. She has passed through it before, for her coronation procession 3 years earlier, when the city had roared her name like a blessing. Today the same stones seem to whisper it back like a curse. Inside, the air is colder than the February wind. The corridors smell of damp wood and extinguished fires. Every footstep echoes twice, once in the hall, once in the mind. Anne's chambers are small but richly appointed. Velvet cushions, embroidered hangings, all the polite trappings of power that now feel faintly ridiculous. Her ladies busy themselves arranging belongings, grateful for the work. She dismisses them quickly. Their nervous energy is worse than silence. Left alone, she sinks into a chair by the narrow window. Beyond it, the Thames flows grey and indifferent. Barges move up and down the river, carrying news she cannot control. She wonders which version of her story is travelling with them. The grieving queen, the cursed wife, the schemer finally undone. Probably all three. England never met a rumour it didn't try on for size. At night the Tower seems to breathe. The old timbers groan, doors creak without reason, the wind moans through arrow slits. Her ladies say it's just the cold. Anne suspects it's the past. 1,000 restless souls with nowhere else to be. She prays softly, not so much for forgiveness as for clarity. Grief has made her mind treacherous. Thoughts slip where they shouldn't. Her first letter goes to Thomas Cromwell. It is polite, precise, written in a hand that trembles only slightly. She calls him my most loyal servant, which is generous given that she's no longer sure he is loyal or a servant. She asks for news of the council, for reassurance, for some sign that her husband's death has not left her entirely unguarded. She seals it herself and presses the wax with her signet, out of habit more than hope. No reply comes. A few days later she writes again, this time to Archbishop Cranmer. The tone is humbler, tinged with desperation. She asks for prayer, for intercession, for God's mercy upon her child and her name. It is a letter of faith written by someone who has begun to doubt. When the messenger returns empty-handed, she says nothing. She simply places her quill back in its holder and stares at the blank paper waiting beside it. Outside her window, the gossip thickens like fog. Word of a possible coup circulates through the court. Norfolk rallying Catholics in the north, Cromwell courting the merchants in the city, the council divided between piety and profit. Everyone seems to be plotting for England's future, except England itself. The streets hum with speculation. One tavern claims Anne plans to flee to France. Another insists she's already fled. A few hopeful souls whisper that she's pregnant again. The only constant is the thrill of imagining a world where someone else must make the difficult decisions. Anne's confinement is not total, but it might as well be. Visitors are rare, and each arrival feels like a test. Ambassadors drop by with condolences laced in curiosity, as if expecting to find her weeping dramatically into silk handkerchiefs. She disappoints them by remaining calm, even dryly witty. "I am not dead yet," she tells one with a thin smile, "though I fear that may be a clerical error." The man laughs nervously, unsure if it's safe to join her in the joke. At night she dreams of the tilt yard, the crowd roaring, the horse rearing, the crash that changed the world. She wakes drenched in sweat, gasping, her hands gripping the sheets like reins. Sometimes she thinks she can still hear the clatter of armour on frozen ground. Sometimes she wonders if this is what haunting feels like, being trapped in a memory that refuses to let you go. Cromwell, for his part, has not forgotten her. He reads her letters carefully before filing them away in a locked chest, their seals unbroken. Each one is a reminder of unfinished business, and he likes his ledgers balanced. The Queen's future, he decides, depends entirely on convenience, a word that has always suited him better than conscience. Weeks pass, and spring begins to creep along the riverbanks, shy and uncertain. The Tower's gardens bloom reluctantly. Anne's ladies bring her a few snowdrops in a vase, and she thanks them with a distant smile. She cannot remember the last time she saw sunlight unfiltered by iron bars. Rumours of rebellion reach her even here. Whispers of Mary's supporters gathering, of Cromwell's allies stockpiling coin, of Norfolk promising loyalty to whoever pays first. She listens, nods, and pretends not to understand the message behind the news, that her name no longer shields anyone, not even herself. Each morning she wakes expecting an order, banishment, trial, release, but none comes. Her captivity has no edges, no timetable. Time itself becomes unreliable. Days blur, nights stretch. Her letters grow shorter, her handwriting smaller. She stops signing them Anne the Queen, and begins signing simply Anne. Sometimes, in her quieter moments, she speaks to Henry. She tells him what she never could while he lived, that she had loved him once, honestly, before ambition spoiled the taste. She imagines his laugh, the one that filled entire rooms, and for a fleeting second, she misses him. Then she remembers what his love had cost her and feels relief instead. The Tower remains silent witness to it all, as it has for centuries. Kings, queens, rebels, martyrs. They come, they vanish, and the stones stay cool and indifferent. The ravens circle overhead, black flecks against the pale sky. Some say if the ravens ever leave, the crown will fall. Anne finds the idea comforting. One evening, as the bells of St. Paul's drift faintly across the river, she sits at her writing table and picks up her quill. For once she writes no letter. She simply moves the pen in slow circles on the page, tracing nothing in particular, as though the motion itself could fill the silence. When the candle guttered out, she didn't replace it. The next morning the servants find her sitting there, calm, awake, and utterly still. The ink has dried. The window is open, letting in a chill breeze. In the quiet of her chamber, she realizes that grief has become her only company. It begins, as most English power struggles do, with a polite meeting that smells faintly of ink and treason. The Duke of Norfolk hosts it naturally, a man who can smell opportunity the way hounds smell blood. He sits at the head of a long oak table, one hand resting on a goblet of wine, the other on the pulse of England itself. Around him gather men of consequence, bishops, courtiers, and those who wish to remain both. They speak softly because in Tudor England, whispers do the heavy lifting of revolution. The topic officially is stability. Unofficially it's Anne Boleyn, or rather how to remove her without looking ungentlemanly about it. Norfolk begins with a sigh, the kind designed to suggest reluctant wisdom. Her Majesty's position, he says, has become uncertain. The others nod solemnly. Relieved someone else has said it first. Then comes the argument. Smooth, unassailable, and utterly self-serving. Without a living heir, he reminds them, Anne's marriage to the late king cannot possibly be valid. It is not politics, you understand. It is simple logic, blessed by both God and convenience. The clergy, eager to redeem themselves after years of royal whiplash, seize the notion like starving men offered bread. They draft proclamations declaring that Elizabeth's claim to the throne is null. The child, they say, is illegitimate. through no fault of her own, of course, but the law is merciless in such matters. It is a decision written in holy ink and political fear. By the end of the week, priests across England are praying for our Sovereign Lady, the Lady Mary, their voices echoing off stone walls that have grown tired of changing their allegiances. Cromwell reads the reports in silence. His face reveals nothing, but his mind moves quickly. He has built his career on aligning himself with the winning side. It would be foolish to stop now. Anne's star is sinking, and Cromwell has no intention of joining her in the dark. He drafts a letter to Norfolk offering support in ensuring the continuity of governance. It's the kind of phrase that could mean anything, and usually does. The Queen, meanwhile, learns of her abandonment in fragments. Servants grow quieter. Her letters go unanswered. The guards at her door shift their eyes when she speaks. The silence around her thickens until it feels like a wall. One morning, she asks for news of her uncle and is told he is indisposed. The truth is simpler. He no longer needs her. Outside the tower, London adjusts quickly. The people have always been practical about their loyalties. Yesterday they cheered for the Queen who brought them a new church. Today they gossip about her downfall between mouthfuls of bread. Market stalls sell trinkets stamped with the initials H&A, now marked down to clear. Street preachers thunder about sin and divine punishment, their voices conveniently aligned with Norfolk's political agenda. In Parliament, the debate is brief. Most members understand that the fastest way to preserve one's neck is to nod at the right moments. The act declaring Anne's marriage invalid passes with minimal fuss. A few mutter that it seems cruel, but cruelty is the currency of government. The king's death has left a void, and nature and politics abhor a vacuum. Cromwell works late into the night overseeing the transition. His handwriting remains elegant, even as he writes Anne's name for the last time in an official document. He deletes her title, replaces Her Majesty with the Lady Anne, and adds a note about relocating her household. It is, in its way, an art form, dismantling a person through paperwork. The next morning the Queen's household receives their notices. Some weep, most bow, all accept. Loyalty, after all, does not pay rent. Her chamberlain departs first, followed by her musicians, her tailors, even her chaplain. Within a day her rooms stand nearly empty, their echo growing louder than her voice. The velvet cushions remain, but they have no audience now. Anne takes the news with the strange calm of someone who has already run out of surprises. She asks for a mirror and studies her reflection. The woman staring back is pale, thinner, older. She still wears the Queen's jewels, though their sparkle feels mocking now. "They suit you," one of her ladies says softly. "Do they?" Anne replies. "I was under the impression they belonged to England." Outside her window, preparations begin for Mary's formal recognition as heir. Banners are ordered, seals recut, prayers rewritten. The machinery of monarchy moves with impressive efficiency once it has decided whom to crush. Anne's crest, the falcon crowned in gold, is pried from the gate of the tower and replaced with the plain Tudor rose. The workers do not look up at her window. They've learned that it's bad luck to meet the eyes of history as it's being rewritten. Cromwell visits her once, out of habit more than mercy. The conversation is short, polite, and meaningless. He assures her that she will be treated with dignity. She thanks him for the courtesy, then asks whether dignity comes before or after confiscation. He smiles faintly, the way one does when confronted with uncomfortable accuracy. "Before," he says. She nods. "Then I shall enjoy it while it lasts." In the city the gossip evolves faster than truth. Some say Anne plans to flee to France, others claim she's taken holy orders. A few insist she's already dead, which, in a way, is true. Public opinion in Tudor England is a swift executioner. The same crowd that once shouted her name now mutters it like a warning. Parents tell their children not to be too clever. Queens, after all, have a way of losing their heads over it. By spring, the transformation is complete. Parliament has spoken, the clergy has blessed, and the court has obeyed. Anne's portraits are quietly removed from the galleries. Her motto, "the most happy," becomes an ironic joke whispered over wine. Even her allies avoid speaking her name. It has become an inconvenience in polite conversation. The last to leave her service is a young maid who cannot bear to stay any longer. She curtsies deeply and says, "Your Grace, they're taking down your crest." Anne, without turning from the window, replies, "Yes, it seems they've finally realised who it truly belongs to." And so the workmen keep at it, chiselling away the falcon and crown, scraping off gold leaf that once gleamed with promise. The fragments fall into the mud, trampled by boots and forgotten by evening. By the next day, the gate looks as though it had never borne her mark at all. The Queen's crest is taken down, her name spoken only in the past tense. Mary Tudor had always been patient. She'd had to be. For years she'd lived in a kind of elegant exile, not quite prisoner, not quite free, waiting for her father's moods to change the direction of her life. She'd watched from a distance while her mother died. Her title was stripped, and her half-sister was celebrated as a miracle of modern sin. And through it all she'd prayed. The habit stuck. So when the news reached her, first a whisper, then a certainty, that her father was dead and Anne Boleyn's fortune had crumbled into dust, she didn't celebrate. She simply went to chapel. Gratitude, after all, is best expressed in Latin. Her household stirred with a kind of cautious hope. Servants who had grown used to speaking in code began using her old title again. Princess Mary, softly at first, then louder. The tapestries came out of storage, the ones embroidered with her mother's crest. Even the cook started smiling, which was considered a political statement in itself. England might have lost a king, but Mary had rediscovered her purpose. The letters began arriving almost immediately. One from her cousin, the Emperor Charles V, carried by men who smelled of sea salt and Spanish confidence. Another from sympathetic bishops, their words dripping with piety and subtext. Each one offered her the same thing: support, discreet, strategic, and entirely conditional. Charles's ambassadors were particularly delicate in their phrasing. They spoke of divine justice, of family honour, of the need to restore true faith to a country that had, in their polite estimation, wandered off the theological path. What they meant was simple. It was time for England to come home to Rome. Mary listened carefully. She was no fool. She knew Spain's interest in her claim had less to do with her virtue, and more to do with controlling an island that kept forgetting which pope it obeyed. Still, alliances were like rosary beads. Useful to have, comforting to hold. She agreed to nothing and thanked them for everything. That was the Tudor way. In London, the shift in mood was almost tangible. Reform had brought confusion, not glory. Monks had been turned out of their monasteries, churches stripped of gold, and ordinary people left wondering why God suddenly needed an accountant. Henry's break from Rome had promised liberation but delivered paperwork. Now, with his death, the English found themselves tired of uncertainty, tired of arguing about theology before breakfast, tired of queens who cried and kings who crashed into horses. Mary, by contrast, seemed a vision of stability. Pale, pious, unflinchingly devout, she represented something the people understood. The old faith, the old order, the comforting certainty that heaven at least had rules. When she appeared in public for the first time after the king's death, the crowd's reaction startled even her. They knelt, not out of habit but relief. For the first time in years, England had a ruler they didn't have to explain. The council, of course, did not share this enthusiasm. Half of them owed their wealth to the Reformation, the other half to the king's whims. Supporting Mary meant choosing sides in a holy war that hadn't officially started yet. Meetings stretched for hours, full of carefully chosen phrases and strategic coughing. Cromwell, sensing his majority slipping, argued that Mary's legitimacy remained in dispute. The bishop stared at him as if watching a man try to debate gravity. Norfolk saw the direction of the wind and wasted no time turning his sails. He began drafting oaths of loyalty to Her Majesty Queen Mary, distributing them through channels both official and suspicious. The signatures came quickly. Men who had once denounced her as illegitimate now rediscovered their consciences with remarkable speed. Hypocrisy, after all, is the only truly renewable resource in politics. In the taverns, the people cheered. In the pulpits, priests rediscovered their Latin. The city that had learned to swallow change now began to regurgitate it. London turned overnight from Protestant experiment to Catholic revival, though most of its citizens were less concerned with theology than survival. One man was heard to remark that he didn't care whether God spoke Latin or English, so long as the price of bread stayed the same. Cromwell watched it all unravel with grim fascination. His neat world of statutes and royal decrees was dissolving into incense and ritual. The queen he'd quietly betrayed was forgotten. The faith he'd helped invent was being traded back to its previous owner. Still, he did not panic. The trick to surviving in Tudor England was simple. Never be the first to oppose a new monarch, and never be the last to agree with them. By spring, Mary's triumph was complete. Parliament had recognised her as Henry's lawful heir, the clergy had blessed her, and the people had embraced her as the return of moral order, or at least the promise of fewer executions for heresy. Her coronation was scheduled with breathtaking efficiency, as if the nation feared she might vanish if left unconfirmed too long. The air smelled of wet stone and sanctity. Processions were planned, vestments repaired, relics dusted off. And so, from the ashes of a king's accident and a queen's fall, England found itself reborn, not into reform, but remembrance. The same city that had once celebrated freedom now longed for forgiveness, and the same church that had been broken apart was slowly, cautiously being pieced back together. England begins to turn its face back toward Rome. Thomas Cromwell had never wanted a crown. He preferred things you could measure, file, and lock in a drawer. But in the strange, echoing months after Henry's death, the kingdom began to tilt toward him whether he liked it or not. Parliament was paralysed. The nobles were busy swearing loyalty to everyone at once, and the people were too exhausted by theology to riot properly. Someone had to keep the lights on, and that someone, by process of elimination and a worrying amount of competence, was Cromwell. He didn't call himself ruler, of course not. Officially, he was merely chief minister in service to the late king's household. Unofficially, every coin stamped, law amended, and priest silenced passed through his hands. The joke in London was that England now had a king who preferred quills to swords and preferred his subjects illiterate, less paperwork that way. His first task was simple in theory: keep the realm solvent. Henry, true to character, had left the treasury as empty as his promises. Cromwell spent long nights with ledgers and candle stubs, shuffling columns of numbers that refused to behave. Monasteries had already been stripped for wealth, so he turned to the nobility, a process much like trying to squeeze blood from gold-plated stones. Taxes rose, bribes flowed. The realm, miraculously, did not collapse, which in Tudor England was the closest thing to success anyone ever achieved. Each morning began with petitions, bishops pleading for funding, merchants complaining about tariffs, widows demanding justice. Cromwell listened to them all with the patience of a man too busy to care. "We'll review it," he'd say, the bureaucrat's gentlest form of execution. At night, he drafted decrees in the king's name, pausing now and then to glance at the empty space where the royal signature should be. It was an absence that seemed to mock him. Without Henry's authority, everything felt provisional. The laws passed, but no one enforced them. The clergy obeyed, but without enthusiasm. The courtiers bowed, but only from habit. Cromwell's orders were respected not because anyone feared him, but because they couldn't agree on who to replace him with. He ruled, in short, by the sheer momentum of paperwork. In public he maintained composure, the calm face of continuity. In private he was fraying. Sleep came in brief, haunted bursts. He dreamed of the tilt yard, of a king's body that never rose, of a crown rolling into the mud while England chased after it. Sometimes, half awake, he'd reach for a quill as if he could sign his way out of guilt. He missed Henry in a strange, unsentimental way. The man had been vain, volatile, and often monstrous. But he'd made decisions. With Henry gone, Cromwell discovered that ruling without a tyrant was somehow harder. Democracy, he decided, was vastly overrated. His reformers, once bold and united, now drifted apart. The Reformation that had burned so brightly began to gutter without its royal sponsor. Preachers lost their pulpits, presses fell silent. Cromwell's grand project, to make England not just richer but holier in its own peculiar way, was unravelling faster than he could stitch it back together. The bishops he'd promoted whispered about returning to Rome. The nobles who'd profited from his reform suddenly found themselves quoting scripture about repentance. Even the clerks in his office crossed themselves again, just in case. Still, he pressed on. He held weekly councils, though fewer and fewer members attended. He reorganised the courts, rewrote tax codes, redrafted trade laws. Anything to keep the machinery moving. At one point he even instituted a national census, partly to measure productivity, and partly to prove to himself that England still existed in measurable form. He was a man trying to save a drowning ship by counting the barrels. The people, for their part, tolerated him the way one tolerates rain, unpleasant but inevitable. He lacked Henry's charisma, Anne's glamour, Mary's piety. He was the face of administration, a nation's nervous system without its beating heart. When he rode through London, crowds didn't cheer. They nodded stiffly, as if acknowledging an accountant they owed money to. Cromwell kept a small portrait of Henry in his study, not out of affection, but as a reminder. "This," he once told a visiting clerk, tapping the frame, "is what happens when a country depends on one man's will. Let's try not to repeat it." The clerk nodded, wisely deciding not to mention that Cromwell had quietly replaced that will with his own. By summer, cracks began to show. The treasury teetered, rebellions murmured in the north, and Rome's envoy sent polite letters suggesting reconciliation. An offer that sounded disturbingly like surrender. Cromwell drafted replies and tore them up again. Every choice seemed to come with its own execution date. And yet, somehow, England endured. The courts functioned, the ships sailed, the bread was baked. It was government not by passion or vision, but by habit. Cromwell had become the reluctant metronome of a kingdom afraid to stop ticking. He wasn't loved, barely respected, but undeniably necessary. One night, as he stood by his window overlooking the city, he realised the truth. No one ruled England anymore. It simply ran on its own, like a mill wheel that couldn't remember who started it turning. He smiled faintly at the thought, half pride, half despair. He had become the ghost of monarchy, the echo of authority, the bureaucrat king presiding over a kingdom that kept moving purely because it didn't know how to do anything else. And in that dim office, surrounded by ledgers, quills, and candle smoke, the great reformer finally understood the nature of his reign. He ruled not by authority, but by inertia. The kingdom ran because it could not stop, and if you've made it this far without stopping either, don't just drift past, subscribe now. Even Cromwell knew the danger of hesitation, and look how that turned out for him. It began, as revolutions often do, not with a shout but with a grumble, the kind of muttering that starts over bread prices and ends in a declaration of faith. In the cold northern counties of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, where the fields stretch wider than ambition, and the churches still smell of incense, the people had finally had enough of London's cleverness. To them, Cromwell's Reformation was not enlightenment. It was vandalism disguised as progress. When the monasteries were stripped, it hadn't felt like divine reform, it had felt like theft. The monks had been clumsy administrators, yes, but they'd also been the region's doctors, teachers, and convenient confessors. Now their lands were sold to southern gentlemen who measured piety in rent payments. The north, as ever, was slow to anger, but once provoked, it rarely stopped at conversation. The first sparks flew in Lincolnshire. A priest named Thomas Kendall delivered a sermon that began piously enough and ended with the phrase, "God save the faith of our fathers." The congregation, always fond of both nostalgia and rebellion, took it as permission. Within days, a crowd had gathered outside the old abbey, carrying whatever weapons farm life provided, sickles, clubs, and the occasional pitchfork that, for once, was not aimed at hay. Someone painted a crude banner of the Virgin Mary and nailed it to a cart. It wasn't art, but it was motivation. News spread northward faster than royal decrees ever could. The message was simple. England had lost its soul, and someone had to find it again. Priests who had been quietly resentful now became leaders of men. They spoke of restoring the monasteries, bringing back the Latin Mass, and chasing the heretics from London. Every tavern became a strategy meeting, every alehouse a parliament of the aggrieved. Cromwell's agents sent word to London, their reports growing more anxious by the hour. The minister read them with the expression of a man who'd been expecting disaster, and was merely disappointed by its punctuality. His clerks suggested deploying troops. He pointed out quite correctly that England currently had no monarch to authorise such a thing. "Then what should we do?" one asked. Cromwell looked up from his papers. "Pray," he said, "and if that fails, count." By count, of course, he meant estimate how many rebels could be bribed before the rest needed hanging. But Cromwell's tidy arithmetic had met its match. This was not a rebellion of nobles, easily pacified with titles or gold, but of ordinary men who genuinely believed God was on their side. And worse, they sang while they marched. The uprising swelled as it moved through Yorkshire, gathering priests, merchants, and farmers alike. Old abbeys were reopened. Monks returned to their cells like ghosts finding their graves undisturbed. At one point, a group of nuns took over a manor house and declared it a holy refuge. When asked under whose authority, they replied, "Heaven's." London didn't know whether to laugh or panic. By October, the movement had taken on a name: the Pilgrimage of Grace. It sounded more like a pious walk than a rebellion, which only made it more dangerous. The rebels carried banners of the Virgin, sang hymns, and referred to themselves as pilgrims rather than soldiers. It was rebellion wrapped in prayer, and that combination unnerved even the seasoned cynics in the capital. In York, a minor noble named Robert Usk emerged as their de facto leader, a lawyer, which meant he could make treason sound respectable. He wrote letters to the council insisting that their cause was peaceful, their aim divine. They wanted the monasteries restored, the evil councillors, meaning Cromwell, removed, and England reconciled with Rome. It was, in other words, a polite request for regime change. Cromwell read Uskie's letters with what might have been admiration, if it weren't so inconvenient. He knew the man was clever, too clever to hang without trial, which admittedly narrowed Cromwell's usual options. For now, he tried negotiation. He sent emissaries north bearing promises of reform, mercy, and consideration, all the currency of a government that had run out of actual money. But promises are poor company in winter. The rebels had already tasted power, and power, like communion wine, is rarely surrendered once swallowed. They marched southward, orderly as a choir and twice as loud. Villages along their path rang church bells in welcome. Local officials joined them rather than resist. Priests walked barefoot beside banners painted with the 5 wounds of Christ, shouting that England would bleed until it was holy again. London trembled. The merchants barricaded their shops, the nobles summoned guards, and Cromwell drafted yet another round of emergency proclamations, which everyone promptly ignored. Even his clerks began crossing themselves again, as if hedging theological bets. One night a messenger burst into his chamber shouting that the rebels had taken Hull. Cromwell looked up from his documents, sighed, and said, "Good. Let them fix the roads while they're at it." Still, humour could only disguise so much fear. The truth was simple and terrifying. Without a king, there was no centre to the storm. The council was divided, the army unpaid, and the people suddenly united in their discontent. North and South eyed each other across an invisible border, papal and reformed, prayer book and rosary, both waiting to see who would blink first. Cromwell stayed up late every night, pacing before his hearth, muttering calculations under his breath. How many soldiers left loyal? How many rebels willing to negotiate? How long before France or Spain decided to help by invading? The air in his chamber was thick with smoke and worry. He could feel the kingdom slipping through his fingers, not in a crash, but in a slow, unstoppable slide. And outside, beyond the reach of parchment and protocol, the sound of marching feet carried south on the cold autumn wind. Thousands of voices rising in hymn and defiance. The North marches on London with prayers and pitchforks. The news arrived quietly, as most disasters do when everyone's too tired to panic. A sealed letter from the North, smudged with travel dust and bad handwriting, landed on Thomas Cromwell's desk one damp morning. He broke the seal, skimmed the words, and for a long moment didn't move. Then he sighed. Not loudly, not theatrically, just the kind of sigh a man makes when the arithmetic of fate has finally stopped balancing. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, the king's only acknowledged son, was dead. 17 years old, clever enough to be dangerous, charming enough to be forgiven for it, and now gone. The official cause was illness, but England had long since stopped trusting official causes. Some said it was consumption, others divine retribution. A few whispered that the boy had died of politics, the most contagious disease in the realm. Cromwell set the letter aside and stared out the window. Rain streaked the glass, turning the world beyond into a watercolour of grey. Somewhere in the city, church bells were tolling again, for the rebellion, for the unrest, for someone else's child. But this time, he felt the sound personally. He'd known Fitzroy since the boy was a page at court, a bright, restless child who had once tried to joust with a broomstick and nearly concussed himself on a wall tapestry. Now, that same boy had died in a bed too grand for his years, attended by physicians who could name every disease except the one that mattered: fragility. The Tudor blood, so proud, so violently ambitious, was thinning before his eyes. For England, it meant more than a funeral. Fitzroy had been the last plausible male heir. Illegitimate, yes, but practical enough to be useful. The plan had been simple: marry him well, legitimise him later, and let time and Parliament handle the details. Now that plan was ash in Cromwell's hands. The realm had run out of Tudors to gamble on. The council received the news with a kind of solemnity politicians reserve for opportunities disguised as tragedies. Norfolk crossed himself with exaggerated grace. The bishops murmured that God had removed another impediment to rightful order, by which they meant Mary's crown. And Cromwell, who had spent years trying to invent stability out of chaos, realised that the chaos had finally outlasted him. Across the north, the rebels took Fitzroy's death as a sign from heaven. Pamphlets appeared overnight, poorly printed but enthusiastic, declaring that the bastard prince's demise proved the wrath of God upon the heretics. One even included a woodcut of the Grim Reaper wearing Cromwell's hat. The artwork was terrible, but the point was clear. The boy's body was brought south under heavy guard, though no one was quite sure whom they were guarding it from. The cortege moved slowly through the rain-soaked countryside, past villages that crossed themselves as it passed. Some bowed in mourning, others in relief. England's relationship with its royal dead was always complicated. At Thetford Priory, the coffin was opened briefly for identification. Those present described the sight with hushed unease. The pale face, the peaceful expression, the faint scent of roses masking the truth of decay. One witness swore that Fitzroy's hand still clutched a small gold cross. Another claimed it was a coin. Either way, he'd been buried with a symbol of value, which in England often meant the same thing. Cromwell attended the funeral in black velvet, his expression carved from stone. Around him stood men who were already rewriting history in their heads, rehearsing the version where Fitzroy had never mattered. The bishop's sermon praised the boy's virtue, his promise, his unswerving loyalty to the crown. Cromwell nearly smiled at that. Fitzroy had been loyal, yes, to whichever future seemed brightest. It was a Tudor trait. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, the rain stopped briefly, as if even the weather had paused to watch the dynasty dig its own grave. Cromwell stood by the grave longer than decorum required, his mind racing through the list of what remained. 2 daughters, one a zealot, the other a child. No sons, no uncles fit for power. The great Tudor tree had blossomed violently and was now rotting from the roots. He imagined Henry, the father, somewhere in purgatory, furious perhaps, or worse, disappointed. The man who had defied Rome, remade his own church, and decapitated anyone who doubted him, all to secure his line. And now the line had ended in a coffin barely large enough to hold a man. The irony was almost elegant. When Cromwell returned to London, he found the city unsettled. Rumours of the boy's death had sparked new prophecies. Street preachers declared that the world was ending. Tavern philosophers declared that it had ended already. They were just drinking through the credits. The people were losing faith, not in God, but in governance. It was a different kind of heresy, quieter and harder to punish. In his study, Cromwell sat beneath the portrait of Henry again and poured himself a cup of wine. He looked up at the painted face, that smirk of authority, that stubbornness immortalized in oil, and said softly, "You won, my lord, and now you've lost everything." The portrait, as usual, had no reply. He drafted a letter to the council that evening, terse and precise. His Grace, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, deceased, it read. The king's issue is thus extinguished in the male line. He hesitated before writing the next sentence. It felt like signing a death certificate for an entire era. The succession remains a matter for resolution. Then he sealed it and sat back, exhausted. The candlelight flickered across the documents, the maps, the lists of names that no longer mattered. He'd spent his life organising chaos, taming it into laws and ledgers, but some chaos refused to be filed away. That night, he dreamed of the royal crest, the red and gold Tudor rose, its petals darkening until they turned black. When he woke, he thought he could still smell smoke. By morning, London was already gossiping about the next heir, because England's favourite pastime was pretending the future could be planned. Cromwell, however, felt none of that optimism. The dynasty had been the kingdom's spine, and now it was broken. Everything that followed would be improvisation. He stood by his window as the first light crept over the river. The city looked weary, like an actor forced to perform without knowing the next line. Somewhere in the distance, a bell began to toll, slow, heavy, inevitable. He closed his eyes, counted the chimes, and whispered what the whole country already knew but refused to say aloud. The name that conquered England dies with a boy who never reigned. By the spring of 1537, England was once again in the mood for a saviour. The rebellion in the north had fizzled but left behind a country raw and divided, half Protestant by law, half Catholic by heart, and entirely exhausted. The fields needed tending, the coffers were empty, and everyone agreed that someone should really do something. As luck and lineage would have it, that someone was Mary Tudor. Mary's march southward began as a rumour, as all good political comebacks do. The first whispers claimed she had raised a modest force, a few thousand men at most, blessed by Rome and funded by her cousin, Emperor Charles V, who considered papal loyalty both a virtue and a useful export. Within weeks, that few thousand had doubled. Within a month, it was an army. The banners bore not the Tudor rose, but the Virgin Mary herself, painted with the kind of enthusiasm that compensates for lack of artistic skill. The march was disciplined and pious, hymns by day, prayers by night, and an unsettling number of confession tents. The people along the route welcomed them like pilgrims instead of soldiers. To the weary English, Mary's cause was not rebellion but restoration. After a decade of chaos, they were ready to trade innovation for predictability, heresy for habit, and Cromwell's bureaucracy for the comfort of Latin they couldn't understand but trusted anyway. In London, Thomas Cromwell watched the reports pile up like unpaid debts. His informants wrote of entire villages swearing oaths to Queen Mary, God's chosen daughter. Even southern garrisons, previously loyal to the crown that no one wore, began to waver. Cromwell knew how this story ended. He'd written it for others often enough. The one who hesitates becomes the villain in the next proclamation. The council met daily in the Tower's echoing halls, though met might be generous. Most sessions involved nobles quietly agreeing with the loudest man in the room until the loudest man changed. Norfolk, always the opportunist, had already sent letters northward, congratulating Mary on her inevitable success. The bishops followed suit, rediscovering a love of the papacy that was touching, if a bit convenient. Cromwell considered resistance. He had maps, fortifications, a few thousand men under his command, and more paperwork than God himself. But what he lacked was conviction and allies. A city could be defended, but an idea could not. Protestantism, without a monarch to embody it, had shrunk into a collection of unpopular pamphlets and half-empty churches, and so he chose the least heroic option available to him: surrender by administrative efficiency. The order went out quietly, written in his neat, unflappable hand. The gates of London are to remain open. No resistance shall be offered to her Grace's approach. It was the kind of sentence that would make future historians squint. Was it cowardice, wisdom, or simple exhaustion? Possibly all three. When Mary's army reached the city, they expected smoke, barricades, resistance. Instead, they found flower garlands and polite applause. Cromwell himself met them at the city gates, hat in hand, dignity just barely intact. Accounts of the meeting vary, but the general consensus is that he bowed low, muttered something about the will of God, and decided against mentioning that he'd helped create the version of God she'd come to destroy. Mary entered London on a grey morning that smelled of rain and redemption. Her procession moved slowly, deliberately. White horse, golden crucifix, and enough incense to fumigate a small village. The crowds packed the streets, shouting her name like a hymn. To them, she was not just Henry's daughter, but England's absolution. Her calm, pale face and dark eyes carried the serenity of a woman certain that God was both on her side and keeping score. Cromwell watched from a balcony as she rode past. For a moment their eyes might have met, or perhaps that was his imagination. He wondered if she knew that he'd chosen surrender to spare the city, or if she thought him weak. Then he realized it didn't matter. History, like monarchs, seldom distinguishes between the two. At St. Paul's, Mary dismounted and entered the cathedral to the thunder of bells. Inside, the choir sang Te Deum Laudamusas. For the first time in years, their Latin syllables rising through the smoke of fresh incense. The marble floors glittered with candlelight, and priests in embroidered vestments smiled like men who'd just received their jobs back. One of them, overcome by emotion, declared that England had been blind but could now see. Cromwell, standing at the back, resisted the urge to point out that blindness had its advantages. Outside, the people cheered until their voices cracked. They had been waiting for order, for certainty, for someone who could make the world feel less precarious. Mary gave them all of it. or the illusion of it, which was almost the same thing. She promised mercy, forgiveness, stability. The city believed her, as cities always do when exhausted enough. That night, bonfires lit the streets. Taverns overflowed with toasts to the new queen, to the old faith, to the end of fear. Cromwell sat alone in his study, watching the flames dance on the river. He knew better than to celebrate. Victory in England was merely the prelude to someone else's fall. The next morning, the Pope's envoy arrived at court with a letter of benediction and a chest of gold. Rome's polite way of saying, "Welcome back." The guards bowed lower than necessary. The council smiled wider than sincere, and the Queen accepted both with saintly grace. The sound of church bells rolled across the city, echoing through every street and alleyway. For the first time in years, the air smelled of sanctity instead of smoke. The merchants crossed themselves, the children mimicked them, and the chroniclers sharpened their quills. And as the bells tolled louder, clearer, triumphant, even the stones of London seemed to vibrate with old memory. The memory of kings, of crowns, of confessions reclaimed. The bells of St. Paul's ring again, this time for Rome. Anne Boleyn was not executed. That in itself was remarkable. England had developed a certain efficiency about beheading inconvenient women, and Anne had certainly qualified. But mercy was not what saved her. Irrelevance did. By the time Queen Mary rode into London, Anne's name had become a footnote, a faded ink stain on a page no one bothered to reread. The rebellion was over, the throne secured, and there was no need to make another martyr. England already had enough ghosts. Cromwell, who had once orchestrated her every triumph, now handled her survival with bureaucratic indifference. "Her Grace," he wrote in one of his final memos before quietly resigning, "is to be removed from the Tower and conveyed under suitable supervision to a house of religious instruction." It sounded charitable, even pious, though everyone knew religious instruction was Tudor shorthand for exile with better acoustics. The journey began on a grey morning, fittingly. Anne left the Tower by barge as she had arrived, though the city barely noticed this time. There were no jeering crowds, no thrown fruit, just the dull splash of oars and the occasional gull mocking from above. Her only companions were a priest who snored and two guards who avoided her gaze. Somewhere near Gravesend she realised she was free, and that freedom, inconveniently, no longer meant anything. Her destination was a small convent in the Kent countryside, recently revived by Mary's restoration of the old faith. It was not a prison, not officially. She could walk the grounds, write letters, pray, or refuse to do all three. The nuns, good women of limited imagination, treated her with cautious respect. To them she was both relic and warning, a woman who had reached too high and lived long enough to regret it. At first, Anne hated the quiet. The silence of the convent was not peace, it was erasure. She had lived in a world of noise, the scrape of lute strings, the clatter of courtiers, the whisper of silk over marble. Here the loudest sound was her own breath. The chapel bells tolled at dawn and dusk, marking hours that no longer belonged to her. Time, once a weapon she wielded through charm and wit, now moved without her permission. She tried to pray, she really did. But her prayers always collapsed into memory. She would begin with Pater Noster, and end with the echo of laughter from some long-ago court feast. She remembered Henry's voice, rich, certain, terrifying in its conviction, and wondered if she had ever truly loved the man, or simply the world that came with him. It didn't matter anymore. He was gone, and she had outlived him, which in its own way felt indecent. The nuns avoided her eyes when they passed. They whispered, though she could guess the content easily enough. The fallen queen, the temptress, the woman who brought down a kingdom. At night she could hear their prayers from the next room, soft murmurs asking God to forgive her pride. She almost laughed the first time she heard it. Pride, she thought, was the one thing keeping her from vanishing entirely. Seasons blurred. She learned the rhythm of the convent, the scratch of quills on parchment, the drip of wax from candles, the rustle of habits in narrow corridors. Sometimes she joined the nuns in the garden, kneeling among herbs and nettles. Her hands, once admired for their elegance, became rough and stained with soil. She found this strangely satisfying. The earth did not care who she had been. Letters arrived occasionally, though she rarely opened them. One from her brother's widow, curt and resigned. Another, unsigned, rumoured to be from Cromwell himself, advising her to embrace quietude. She burned that one, not out of anger, just to see something disappear on purpose. Every now and then, a visiting noble would stop by, eager to glimpse the infamous queen turned penitent. They would find her sitting by the window, embroidery in hand, face calm and unreadable. She spoke courteously but without warmth. To one particularly eager visitor who remarked that she looked at peace, she replied, "Peace is just exhaustion with better manners." The poor man never quite recovered from the remark. In the convent chapel hung a small crucifix, silver, simple, unadorned. Anne often sat before it, studying the figure of Christ, the crown of thorns, the outstretched hands. She envied him, not for divinity but for narrative closure. His suffering had meaning. Hers had been rewritten by committee. Outside, England changed again. Mary's reign settled into its strange mix of piety and paranoia. Heretics burned, cathedrals reopened. The old world, the one Anne had helped dismantle, was resurrected brick by brick. Word of it reached the convent in pieces. A bishop restored here, a monastery reopened there. Anne listened without comment. Once she'd shaped history. Now she merely overheard it. Sometimes, when the wind carried the distant sound of bells from Canterbury, she felt the faintest flicker of defiance. They rang for Mary now, for Rome, for everything she had once stood against. And yet, there was something almost comforting in the predictability of it. England, fickle as it was, had finally found its rhythm again. She had been the dissonant note, and the song went on without her. In her later years, the convent chronicler recorded that the Lady Anne lived quietly, often ill, ever penitent. It was a polite lie, the sort history prefers. The truth was simpler. She was not penitent, merely tired, not broken, just finished. She no longer argued with God because silence made a better companion. One winter morning, a novice found her sitting by the window, motionless, her embroidery fallen to the floor. The candle beside her had burned itself out. The abbess ordered prayers to be said, though no one quite knew what for. The queen who had changed England with a glance was gone, leaving nothing behind but a name most dared not speak. Her grave was unmarked, her legacy divided, her story absorbed into the machinery of other people's triumphs. Anne Boleyn was spared execution, but not obscurity. She lives, but history does not wait for the living. Mary Tudor had waited her entire life to be Queen of England, and when she finally sat on the throne at 20, she did it with the solemn composure of someone attending her own coronation and her own funeral at once. She'd inherited a realm exhausted by politics, divided by faith, and haunted by the ghosts of its own reforms. But Mary, God's most dutiful daughter, did not flinch. She saw England as a soul gone astray, and herself as the one appointed to bring it home. Her first official act was to kneel, not before her council or her court, but before the crucifix, restored to its rightful place in the royal chapel. The chroniclers wrote that she wept, though with Mary tears were never weakness, merely punctuation. When she rose, her face was set in that peculiar Tudor calm, absolute certainty disguised as gentleness. "God's will is England's will," she said. It was a lovely sentiment, though history would later suggest the two rarely got along. Her government moved with the precision of a confessional. Cromwell's reforms were unwound one signature at a time. Acts of Parliament declaring Henry supreme head of the Church were repealed. Monks returned to their cloisters like veterans returning from exile. The papal emissary arrived in London to thunderous bells, kissing the Queen's ring and declaring the nation reconciled to Rome. For the first time in years, incense rose in Westminster Abbey, and no one coughed in protest. Mary called it healing. Her subjects called it a relief mostly. The merchants were tired of new laws, the bishops were tired of ambiguity, and the peasants were just tired. When the Queen declared a general pardon for the northern rebels, those who had marched under the Virgin's banners the year before, it was met with cautious gratitude. The pardon did not erase their crimes, but it made them less urgent, and that was good enough. Even Cromwell's former bureaucrats found their positions restored, provided they learned to say His Holiness again without choking. The kingdom, it seemed, was finally settling into something that looked like peace, if one squinted. But peace, in Tudor England, was a fragile performance. Beneath the hymns and the gilded processions, a different kind of work was quietly beginning. Lists were drawn, letters intercepted. The Queen, merciful as she was, had no intention of sharing her throne with those who questioned the faith she'd been born to defend. It began delicately. A bishop here, a preacher there, men summoned to clarify their positions. Some clarified poorly, others clarified loudly, usually from a prison cell. The prisons filled with reformers who had once burned with evangelical zeal and now found themselves explaining theology to guards who couldn't read. Mary didn't enjoy the punishments. She was not cruel, at least not in the recreational sense. But she had inherited her father's conviction that salvation required a firm hand and her mother's belief that suffering was good for the soul. It was a dangerous combination. When her advisor suggested leniency, she replied, "Mercy is God's privilege. Mine is obedience." Still, she preferred correction to execution, for now. Her aim was not vengeance, but purification. She wanted England to confess, not bleed. Yet confession, as it turned out, was an unpopular hobby. In the taverns, people whispered of burnings that hadn't yet happened, of arrests that hadn't yet occurred. Fear, as usual, proved more efficient than fact. Mary spent her evenings in prayer, surrounded by candles that seemed to outnumber her friends. She wrote letters to Charles, her cousin and patron, assuring him that England was returning to grace. She even wrote one to the Pope, thanking him for his paternal kindness. The Pope, reading it in Rome, reportedly smiled and murmured that paternal kindness was expensive. Her council, meanwhile, fretted over finances. Restoring monasteries, rebuilding churches, and forgiving rebels all came with bills. Mary's treasurer quietly noted that faith, while spiritually profitable, was not fiscally sound. Still, the Queen pressed on. "We have lived too long in debt to God," she told him. "Let the realm repay what it owes." In the streets the mood was complicated. Processions filled London, priests swinging censers, choirs singing Latin hymns, children dressed as angels tripping over their wings. The people cheered, though no one was quite sure whether from belief or habit. A few reformists fled to Antwerp, muttering that England had gone mad again. The rest stayed, reasoning that madness was safer than exile. For a while it seemed to work. The nation breathed, prayed, pretended. But even the most devout subjects noticed that their queen's eyes had begun to look older, harder. The crown sat heavy on her small frame, and though she smiled when required, her smiles had the precision of sculpture. Beautiful, but immovable. She was 20 years old and already looked like a saint carved in stone. The poets of the court, eager to please, compared her to the Virgin Mary. It was flattering if inaccurate. The Virgin had been a figure of grace. Mary Tudor was a force of gravity, pulling England back toward Rome whether it wanted to go or not. Her reign was a sermon, and her people its reluctant congregation. As spring turned to summer, the bells of London rang almost daily, for coronations, reconciliations, feast days, and thanksgivings. Each one proclaimed her triumph, yet somehow sounded like warning. Even the ravens at the tower seemed unsettled, as if remembering how quickly England's blessings tended to sour. But for the moment, Mary stood unchallenged. Her faith was law, her word was peace, and her peace was built upon exhaustion. The Queen, newly crowned, looked out over her kingdom from the balcony of Whitehall Palace, the Thames glimmering below like liquid pewter. The crowd cheered until it hurt their throats. She raised her hand, not in command but benediction, and for a moment she almost believed that harmony was possible. A queen crowned in peace, dreaming of a kingdom that will never truly forgive her, and while forgiveness takes time, clicking subscribe doesn't. Don't wait for history to be kind, at least let the algorithm be. The end of Thomas Cromwell came quietly, which was almost disappointing. For a man who'd rearranged an entire kingdom with pen and paper, you'd expect a little more noise. But by the time Queen Mary's reign found its rhythm, that curious blend of incense and inquisition, Cromwell had already become a relic of the wrong faith. His enemies, of course, preferred to call him a necessary sacrifice. The phrase had a certain charm, pious, bloodless, and conveniently vague. Officially, his crimes were corruption and heresy. Unofficially, his real sin was that he'd run out of friends. The bureaucrat king, once indispensable, was now the man everyone pretended not to know at court dinners. The arrest came early one morning, as Cromwell sat reviewing the week's reports in his chambers at the Tower. The guards entered quietly, hats in hand, apologetic in the way only Englishmen can be when committing treason politely. He didn't fight. He simply folded the letter he'd been reading, placed it neatly on the desk and said, "I was wondering when order would return." It was the kind of dry remark that reminded everyone why they'd hated him, and feared him in equal measure. They took him to the same tower he had once used as his own filing cabinet for other people's downfalls. Irony, it turned out, had an impeccable sense of timing. In London, the news spread with indecent speed. Merchants pretended to mourn, bishops pretended to pray, and every ambitious noble pretended not to smile. Pamphlets appeared overnight, unsigned, naturally, denouncing Cromwell as the heretic who had poisoned the realm with false scripture. No one mentioned that most of them had profited handsomely from that same poison. Hypocrisy, like the plague, was an English tradition by now. His trial, if one can call it that, was brisk. Evidence was presented in the form of accusations. Witnesses were optional. The charge sheet listed offences both mortal and imaginative. One line read, "He did conspire to spread the false gospel in the English tongue." In other words, he had made the Bible understandable, which was apparently unforgivable. By summer, the verdict was inevitable. Cromwell was sentenced to death, not for rebellion or theft, but for translation, the great English crime of making knowledge accessible. As he awaited execution, he asked for a Bible, which was, by then, an act of irony so pure it almost counted as performance art. Meanwhile, the Queen's campaign of restoration moved efficiently through the realm. The printing presses that had once clattered through the night now sat silent, their wheels dismantled, their operators suddenly very devout in their silence. Books written in English, Bibles, sermons, tracts, were gathered in piles and burned in the squares where reformers had once preached. The smoke, witnesses said, smelled of ink and fear. In Oxford and Cambridge, scholars quietly switched back to Latin, muttering that it was safer to be unreadable than dead. The presses that had once printed Tyndale's daring words now churned out safer fare, papal decrees, royal edicts, prayers that had been vetted for theological hygiene. To own an English Bible was to invite suspicion. To read it aloud was to audition for martyrdom. The reformers who hadn't fled found other ways to disappear. Some recanted publicly, others mislaid their convictions in private. Those who refused were dealt with discreetly, A few executions here, a disappearance there. England, for all its new piety, preferred its persecutions tidy. Cromwell's execution was held in the usual place, Tower Hill, under a sky that looked as grey and unimpressed as ever. The crowd came out of habit, not hatred. England had learned to treat public death like theatre, sad but necessary for the story. He climbed the scaffold with his typical composure, adjusted his cloak and made no speech. He'd spent his whole life writing speeches for other men. There seemed little point in composing one now. The executioner, newly reappointed under the Queen's Catholic regime, asked for forgiveness. Cromwell smiled faintly. "That depends," he said, "on your accuracy." The blade fell cleanly, one of the few efficient acts in Tudor government that year. When the head was held up for the crowd, there was a murmur, not cheers, not gasps, just a kind of collective exhale. Another era had ended. The Reformation, that brief and noisy experiment in English defiance, was over. What had begun with Luther's hammer and Henry's temper ended with a thud and a silence that felt heavier than sound. In the month that followed, England rewound itself. Monks reclaimed their cloisters. Churches, once stripped bare of saints and relics, now glittered again with gold. The language of worship slipped back into Latin, smooth and inscrutable, the way God apparently preferred it. The people murmured along, comforted by the rhythm, if not the meaning. Yet not everyone forgot. In taverns, in back rooms, in whispered gatherings, fragments of forbidden verses survived. The English Bible, that dangerous revolutionary idea, refused to die entirely. Its words lingered like embers beneath ash, waiting for a kinder wind. But for now, the wind blew from Rome. Queen Mary had restored the old order. England had traded clarity for obedience and knowledge for peace. The printing presses that had once sung of freedom now groaned under the weight of decrees. The kingdom, once loud with questions, was quiet again. And somewhere in that vast, holy silence, the meaning of faith retreated behind the curtain of a language most of its followers no longer understood. The word of God goes back into Latin, and the people back into darkness. There are ghosts history never gets to meet. Children who were never born. Kings who never ruled. Poets who never wrote. In another world, England would have known them all. But in this one, the story ended early, quietly, without fanfare or prophecy. Henry VIII's fall had rewritten not only his dynasty but the imagination of an entire nation. There was no Edward VI, the sickly boy king who would have played theologian before puberty and made England briefly Protestant again. No fevered councils debating how to run a kingdom for a child. No sudden death at 16. No scramble for successors. No Jane Grey. The tragedy of youth was spared, because youth itself had been erased. And there was no Elizabeth. No Gloriana. No virgin queen wrapped in myth and pearls. No woman who turned survival into art and indecision into empire. England would never know the taste of her ambition, the sting of her wit, the dizzying contradiction of her rule. The golden age never dawned, because the sun that should have risen in her name had never been born. Without Elizabeth, there was no armada, no great clash of faith and fortune off the English coast. Spain never sent its fleet to be dashed against Protestant defiance, because there was no Protestant defiance left to provoke it. The English navy remained modest, more preoccupied with fishing than glory. The shipwrights of Devon still built fine vessels, but they carried wool and wine instead of cannon and destiny. There was no Shakespeare. Or rather, there was probably a man named William Shakespeare, a clever lad from Warwickshire, fond of stories and stagecraft. But he would never have found a theatre to hold him. There was no Queen's Men, no Globe rising from the banks of the Thames, no plays performed for courtiers drunk on their own cleverness. In this England, drama was still liturgical, not literary. Scripture, not soliloquy. The only verse performed was sung in Latin, and the only tragedies were biblical. Without Elizabeth's England, there was no empire, no red thread of conquest binding distant lands to London's ambition. The merchants stayed close to home, their ships hugging the familiar coasts of France and Flanders. The East India Company was never founded. The English learned their spices second-hand, politely borrowing flavour from their Spanish neighbours. The Atlantic was someone else's gamble. England preferred its island certainties. The scholars at Oxford and Cambridge wrote in Latin, as their grandfathers had. The universities remained monasteries in all but name, quiet, self-contained, respectful of authority. Knowledge moved slowly again, wrapped in parchment and incense. The great humanist tide that might have swept England into modernity lapped instead at the edges and withdrew. And yet, it was not a miserable kingdom, far from it. The people prayed, harvested, married, and died in peace. There were no burnings in Smithfield, no martyrs, no heretics, because there were no arguments left worth dying for. The air was filled not with rhetoric, but with ritual. Bells marked the hours, fields marked the seasons. It was a simpler kind of continuity, not progress, but permanence. London remained small, devout, and faintly provincial. Its streets smelled of bread, not ambition. St. Paul's stood unscarred by fire or reform, its altars heavy with gold and its sermons delivered to an audience that nodded rather than thought. The Thames flowed quietly, untroubled by foreign sails. Even the weather seemed less dramatic, as if the sky itself had grown conservative. History, it turns out, can end without ending. England survived, just smaller, a country defined by what it did not dare to become. Its poets wrote hymns instead of histories, its painters stuck to saints and sunsets, and its philosophers contented themselves with prayer. The restless brilliance that once sought to conquer the world folded neatly into devotion. And perhaps that was the point. For all its lost grandeur, this England was content. No empires to overreach, no kings to behead, no playwrights to question God or government. Just quiet faith, solid harvests, and the comforting certainty that tomorrow would look almost exactly like today. The chroniclers called it an age of peace. But when you read their words closely, you can hear the faint melancholy between the lines, a sense that something magnificent had been traded away too cheaply, that in their hunger for order, they'd forgotten the beauty of disarray. No Renaissance spark, no golden court, no language stretching itself toward immortality, just the rhythm of bells, the mutter of prayers, and the slow heartbeat of a kingdom that mistook stillness for safety. Somewhere in the archives of eternity, perhaps, there's another England, one where a red-haired queen still strides across a stage of continents, where poets give her speeches she never spoke, where a nation discovers that faith and brilliance can coexist without devouring each other. But not here, not in this quieter version of the world. This one remains small, sincere, and endlessly devout. A nation that found peace and mistook it for purpose. Greatness traded for peace, brilliance for obedience. History, they say, is written by the victors, but it is haunted by the survivors. And if you walk along the river at Greenwich on a grey January morning, you can still feel it. The chill of something unfinished. The faint echo of a heartbeat that never quite resumed. The ghost of Henry VIII lingers there, not the man but the idea of him, the ghost of what might have been. He does not stride through the halls in fury, nor clank in armour demanding a crown. He drifts, quiet as thought, through corridors that smell of dust and river air. The tapestries hang as they did in life, heavy with scenes of triumphs that never happened. His eyes, once bright with appetite and authority, now wander over a world that continued without him, a kingdom faithful, orderly, and smaller than his dreams. It's not a restless haunting, not the sort that rattles chains or curses the living. It's gentler, the melancholy of unrealized futures. The ghost of Henry walks the gardens where his courtiers once cheered, but the cheers have faded into the hum of bees and the whisper of prayer. In this world there are no royal decrees echoing down the corridors, no music of excess or fear. Only the quiet contentment of a country that never learned to roar. History has many such ghosts, not of the dead, but of the unchosen. The roads not taken, the kings who never ruled, the battles never fought. Each one leaves behind a question, soft but insistent. What did we lose when we were spared? England's peace, in this alternate century, has become a sort of sanctified sleep. The fields are rich, the people devout, the church is whole. There are no executions for heresy, because there are no heresies left to invent. The flames that might have burned martyrs instead warm abbots' hands. The crown is secure, the faith unquestioned, and the imagination comfortably dormant. It is, by all practical measures, paradise, which is to say, nothing much happens. And yet, the ghost of Henry lingers, because even in death, he cannot help but wonder what his chaos might have built. He was, for all his faults, a man of motion, a creature of hunger, pride, and consequence. Without him, the world feels too still. The Reformation never quite catches fire, the empire never quite begins, the language never bursts into poetry. The kingdom is preserved but uninspired. Would we prefer it this way? Would we trade the terror of Henry's tyranny for the quiet decency of this gentler England? Would we give up the crown of empire for the comfort of peace? The question sits there like fog on the river, shapeless, impossible to grasp, and impossible to ignore. Sometimes, when the winter mist thickens over Greenwich, it's said you can see his shadow on the water, a vast shape astride a horse that never quite moves. Historians dismiss it, of course, but then historians are trained to measure only what happened, not what might have. They forget that history's true weight lies not in fact, but in possibility. The ghost of Henry is not alone either. Around him drift the echoes of others. Anne, silent in her convent cell. Cromwell, still tallying invisible ledgers. Young Fitzroy, forever 17, carrying a crown that never existed. Even Mary, pious and weary, kneeling before an altar that never quite forgave her. They are the congregation of the unreal, England's unfinished prayers, and what they share is not regret but curiosity. What would have become of them if the horse had stumbled differently, if the lance had struck a little deeper? Would England have burned brighter, even if it burned shorter? Did the monster need to rise so the miracle could follow? Because that, in the end, is the paradox. Without Henry's survival, his ambition, his fury, his ruin, there would be no Elizabeth, no Shakespeare, no empire, no restless brilliance that reshaped half the world. The price of peace, it seems, is potential. In saving itself from one man's madness, England saved itself from its own magnificence. The ghost of Henry, they say, never weeps. He only listens. To the bells tolling across the river, to the quiet murmurs of prayers that once would have enraged him. He listens to the peace he created by dying, and perhaps he wonders if it was worth it. Would we prefer the peace of this world, or the fire of the one we got? Did England need a monster to become magnificent? Or did magnificence simply require a body count? The fog thickens. The palace fades. The river swallows its reflections. The past, as always, refuses to explain itself. And so, somewhere in the cold January fog, the horse never rose, the king never stirred, and the future took a gentler, lonelier path. You've just drifted through a history that died before it began, a quiet England that traded its crown of fire for a candle flame. You've walked the silent halls of Greenwich, listened to bells that never tolled for empire, and watched a kingdom choose peace over brilliance. Strange, isn't it? How even imagined history leaves its own kind of echo. Soft, persistent, refusing to fade. If you're still awake, or somewhere between dreaming and the past, take a breath. The room around you is still, but your mind has just crossed centuries. You've seen queens spared and kings erased, rebellion soothed, and prayers answered too well. You've wandered the England that might have been, where ambition slept and poetry never woke. In the end, that's the magic of these ghostly histories. They remind us that every silence once had a sound. That peace, however beautiful, is never free. Somewhere, in some version of time, Henry still rises from the dirt and the world burns brighter for it. But not here. Here, the fires went out before the match was struck. So, close your eyes. Let the last traces of the story settle. The wind outside might be just the ordinary world, or it might be the breath of a history that almost happened, brushing past to say goodnight. If you're still here, don't slip away without subscribing. The past doesn't ask often. It whispers once. Sleep well, traveller. The ghosts of history are kind. They only visit in dreams. And if you've stayed with me all this way, through crowns and candles, through the quiet turning of what might have been, then know this. You've just kept the story alive a little longer. Subscribing, sharing, listening. It isn't just support, it's how the past survives. You're part of that now. Thank you, truly.